In my last video, we took a look back at the year that was, as I counted down 25 of my favourite games of 2021, so it's only natural that my next video would be a look forward at what's coming in 2022. So strap in for a huge video, as we're going to be doing that by going through 75 of the biggest games scheduled to release this year. 2022 is shaping up to be one of the biggest years in gaming history. In fact, it's such a colossal year for games that I actually had to cut games from this list to get it down to 75. Now, we've got a ton of games to get through, so let's not waste any more time and get straight into the list. Nobody Saves the World is the latest game from Drinkbox, the studio behind indie darlings like Guacamelee and Severed. Nobody Saves the World is an action RPG starring the titular Nobody, a powerless being who upon discovering a magic wand unlocks the ability to transform into a myriad of different forms, each with their own unique abilities. I've been a huge fan of this studio since the PS3 days, so you know I jumped into Nobody Saves the World the second it dropped, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. I can also confirm that Nobody Saves the World will be my first review of the year, so be sure to keep an eye out for it. Rainbow Six Extraction is a tactical shooter that's aiming to be to PvE what Rainbow Six Siege is to PvP. Extraction sees the operators of Siege facing off against a parasitic alien threat and tackling a series of randomly generated tasks across a variety of different maps, and it can be played alone or in groups of up to 3. I could never get into Siege, but I have been playing Extraction, and it's really got its hooks into me. I've put about a dozen hours into it over the past few days, and I don't see myself putting it down anytime soon. Windjammers is the very definition of a cult classic. The original Neo Geo release has gathered a pretty big fan base over the years due to its killer soundtrack, beautiful pixel art, and addictive gameplay that offers near endless replayability. And now in 2022, the beloved disc-throwing classic is finally getting its long overdue sequel. If you haven't played Windjammers before, you can basically think of it as a more advanced version of Pong, where two players fling a frisbee back and forth, attempting to get past their opponent to score a point. Windjammers 2 offers a bigger roster of playable characters and arenas than its predecessor, and a full arcade mode for solo players. I love Pokemon, but even as a long-time fan, I think we can all admit that the series is in desperate need of rejuvenation. Its core gameplay hasn't shifted that much since the original games, and it's feeling like the series is starting to spin its wheels a little. Fortunately, it seems like Game Freak are aware of this, and Pokemon Legends Arceus looks to be breaking the cookie-cutter mold. Pokemon Legends Arceus is undeniably the most ambitious game Game Freak have ever made. This truly looks like a major evolution of the Pokemon franchise, with its sprawling open world and new mechanics like the ability to ride Pokemon and manually aim and throw Pokeballs to capture Pokemon, feeling like a real step forward from prior games. Pokemon Legends' vast and picturesque world seems to have taken a page out of Breath of the Wild's book, which is definitely a good thing. If Arceus can make its exploration even a fraction as satisfying as Breath of the Wild's, it'll be something truly special. Of course, I do have a couple of concerns with a game this ambitious, namely with its visual and technical fidelity. In Arceus' trailers, we've seen some rough textures and frame drops, and certain areas do look very sparse. Only time will tell if Pokemon Legends Arceus will live up to its potential, but nevertheless, I'm very excited for it. Uncharted has been one of my favourite franchises since I played Drake's Fortune on the PS3. And Uncharted 4: A Thief's End and Uncharted The Lost Legacy are two of my favourite games of the last generation. I'd even say that Uncharted 4's spectacular set pieces and fulfilling story that brings Nathan Drake's journey to a satisfying end make it the best game in the series. So Sony don't need to twist my arm to get me excited to revisit these games. In fact, I'm ecstatic to have an excuse to replay and platinum both of them again. The Legacy of Thieves collection is set to provide the definitive editions of these two games, as it'll add 3D audio, support for the DualSense's haptic feedback and adaptive triggers, and both games have been fully remastered, allowing for even better graphics and smoother performance than what you'll find in the already beautiful PS4 versions. Speaking of games that I'm looking forward to revisiting and platinuming again, the 1st of February will finally see the release of the Life is Strange Remastered Collection after it was delayed out of 2021. The Remastered Collection includes enhanced versions of both the first Life is Strange and its prequel series Before the Storm. I like both of these games, but I have a particular soft spot for Before the Storm, which was my favourite Life is Strange game until True Colours released last year. While these games were always worth playing for their stories, they had a lot of rough edges visually, especially the first game, so they seem like ideal candidates for a remaster. Dying Light 2 has been a long time coming. Now 7 years after the original Dying Light released, we're finally getting the long-awaited sequel. Dying Light's unique blend of zombie slaughtering carnage and Mirror's Edge-esque parkour quickly led to it becoming a fan favourite, and I have very fond memories of the dozens of hours I put into it at launch. I just remember being blown away by how big of a jump forward Dying Light was for Techland, improving on their Dead Island games in every conceivable way. Dying Light 2's scope seems much bigger than the originals, with more robust traversal mechanics, a map 4 times the size of the one found in the first game, and a branching story where you'll have to decide which factions to align yourself with. In a time when we were starved for new skateboarding games, an indie gem called OlliOlli came along to fill the void. OlliOlli and OlliOlli 2 were pixel art side-scrollers, which made them drastically different to any skateboarding games that came before them, but they still maintained a focus on stringing together massive combos that combine as many tricks as possible, like the Tony Hawk games. OlliOlli World is introducing new mechanics to the franchise, like levels with branching paths, and it sees the series ditching its signature pixel art look in favour of a hand-drawn 2.5D art style. I've got to say, I'm not in love with the new art style, but if OlliOlli World can retain the addictive gameplay of its predecessors, I'm sure I can get used to it. Sifu is an amazing looking martial arts game with a unique twist. Each time you die in Sifu, your character ages, and if you die too many times, it's game over and you'll have to start again. As the protagonist ages, his attacks become more powerful as his mastery of martial arts increases, but his health bar also shrinks as he's slowly becoming more frail. Sifu looks stylish as all hell, and if it controls as well as its trailers lead me to believe it will, this could be a huge moment for Sloclap that has the potential to hugely elevate the studio's public perception. Crossfire is a multiplayer shooter that's huge in Asia, but what makes its Western release as Crossfire X so tantalising is the addition of a campaign that's being developed by Remedy Entertainment. From Alan Wake to Control, I've loved just about everything Remedy has ever made, so you know I'll be jumping into Crossfire X the second it drops. This will be something completely different for Remedy, as they've traditionally only made third-person action-adventure games, so I'm incredibly curious to see what their unique style can bring to the first-person shooter genre. King of Fighters 15 is set to be the first big fighting game of 2022. SNK's tentpole fighting franchise has managed to maintain a hardcore fan base for the better part of 30 years, but the series quality has fluctuated wildly over recent entries, with 12 being largely regarded as a low point for the series, so it's hard to tell exactly what we're getting with King of Fighters. But there are a lot of signs indicating that King of Fighters 15 will be a success. Not only is there little fighting game competition at the moment, King of Fighters 15 is also set to transition the series onto a new engine, and it'll offer rollback netcode and a massive roster of 40 playable characters at launch. Horizon is arguably my favourite new IP of the last generation. Everything about it just worked for me. I loved the spectacle of its battles that saw you slowly dismantling its gigantic robotic enemies. I thought its creature designs were some of the best I've ever seen, and I was enamoured with its world and lore. So obviously, I'm extremely excited for Horizon Forbidden West, and it looks like Guerrilla are giving me everything I'd want from a sequel to Zero Dawn. Aloy's arsenal has been fleshed out further with a bunch of new gadgets that'll add even more variety to battles and exploration. Environments are more diverse than before, with massive underwater areas to explore, and the cast is expanding with interesting looking newcomers, including a character played by none other than Matrix star Carrie-Anne Moss. I'd also be remiss to not point out just how absurdly beautiful Horizon Forbidden West looks. And the best news of all is that we don't even have to wait that long for Forbidden West, as we're less than 3 weeks away from launch now. From Software are one of my favourite studios, with Bloodborne and Dark Souls being not only among my favourite games of all time, but arguably some of the best games ever made. FromSoft never failed to craft engaging battle systems and bizarre and twisted worlds that are endlessly fascinating to explore, and Elden Ring looks like From's biggest and most ambitious game yet. With an expansive world that allows for horseback exploration, lore written by George R.R. Martin, and more of From's epic signature boss fights, there's a lot of reasons to be excited for Elden Ring. There was a time between the 90s and mid-2000s when we were inundated with snowboarding games, but nowadays there's hardly any of them. It was during the PS2/Xbox/GameCube generation that the genre seemed to be at its apex, no pun intended. For me, SSX was the clear king of the genre, but it did have some stiff competition in the form of the Xbox exclusive Amped series, a franchise that a lot of Xbox fans swear by. Shredders is a spiritual successor to Amped, and it looks pretty promising. We'll have to wait and see if Shredders can recapture the magic of the old school extreme sports games, but it's always nice to see passionate developers find a gap in the market and decide that they'll be the ones to fill it. It's impossible to deny that Platinum Games have the ability to make some of the best action games on the market. They've proved this time and time again with games like Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, Vanquish, Astral Chain, and Nier Automata. But they've also made a couple of real duds, like The Legend of Korra and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutants in Manhattan. It seems clear that among their multiple teams, there is a distinct divide between good Platinum and bad Platinum. And unfortunately, I am very worried that Babylon's Fall could be coming from bad Platinum, while their A-team is hard at work on Bayonetta 3. Babylon's Fall is visually unimpressive, and its beta was met with an almost universally negative response. But I just can't help but be curious about Babylon's Fall. I don't want to write it off completely. Platinum have more hits than misses, and I just hope that they've taken on board the feedback from the beta and addressed some of the issues people had with Babylon's Fall. Honestly, this game has potential, but it feels like a game that needs more time in the oven. It's been about 5 years since Gran Turismo Sport launched, and about 8 years since the last numbered Gran Turismo game was released, so GT fans are hungry for a new game. While I'm not a big simulation racing fan, I know that Gran Turismo has remained essential to the PlayStation ecosystem since the PS1 days for good reason. These games are lauded for their tight, responsive controls, and they never fail to be a technical showcase for PlayStation's consoles. And with Gran Turismo 7 running at 60 frames per second and offering 4K visuals with ray tracing, I have no doubt that it'll continue this trend and be a massive graphical showpiece for the PS5. It's always an event when a GT game launches, so I have no doubt that this will be one of the best-selling PlayStation games of 2022. Triangle Strategy is the next game to use the stupidly beautiful HD 2D art style after it debuted in Octopath Traveler. This style blends traditional pixel art with 3D environments to add depth and create a diorama-like visual effect. It's unlike anything I've seen before, and I genuinely think it's one of the only cases where I could be sold on a game by visuals alone. Fortunately, it looks like Triangle Strategy will provide more than just pretty visuals though, as its gameplay also looks stellar. As the name implies, Triangle Strategy is a turn-based strategy game in the vein of Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre. I happen to really like this style of RPG, and it's not a style that we see enough of. This also seems like the perfect fit for the Switch, as it's no doubt going to be a meaty game, so being able to chip away at it on commutes or while in bed feels ideal. Kart racers are another type of game that I love and feel like we don't get a lot of. Apart from Mario Kart and Crash Team Racing, it feels like pretty slim pickings if you're after a good kart racer. That's not a slight on those games, they're the undisputed kings of the genre for a reason, but more competition would definitely be appreciated, and I'm hoping that's what Chocobo GP will provide. I love the idea of racing around familiar locations like the Gold Saucer from Final Fantasy VII or Alexandria from Final Fantasy IX as a roller skating Chocobo. As someone who loves both Final Fantasy and kart racers, I don't expect this to be a masterpiece by any means, but I'm hoping that it will at least be a fun 7 out of 10 kind of experience. The WWE 2K series is making its return this year after taking a year off following the disastrously bad WWE 2K20. For those unfamiliar with what's going on with the WWE 2K series, for years it was developed by a team called Yuke's, but following the release of 2K19, the team decided to move on from working on the 2K series after becoming frustrated by the limitations of working on annual releases year after year. This led to a new team, Visual Concepts, taking over the series and being forced to make WWE 2K20 from scratch in less than a year. Unsurprisingly, WWE 2K20 was a mess. It was panned by critics and fans alike for its atrocious visuals and endless array of glitches. Now, Visual Concepts are getting another chance at the series with 2K22, and I can only hope for the sake of wrestling fans that the significantly longer development time of 2K22 will allow it to be leagues better than its predecessor, and a return to form for the WWE series. Of course, we're not going to know if 2K22 is any good until we know how it feels to play, but if its trailers are anything to go by, it at least seems a lot more polished visually than other recent WWE titles. Tunic is an impressive looking Zelda-like that stars a cartoon fox, and it's been a long time coming after being shown for about 5 years, and in 2022, it's finally set to launch. But there's a good reason that Tunic has been in development for so long. Amazingly, Tunic is being made by just one developer, which when you look at Tunic's striking art style and charming world, is almost difficult to believe. As you'd expect, Tunic features all the staples of a Zelda-like: sword and shield based combat, puzzles, and a world map where new traversal opportunities become available as you discover different items. Tunic looks incredible and has the potential to be this year's Death's Door. Persona 4 Golden is my favourite game of all time. It's got my favourite cast of characters in a game ever, so of course I'm also a sucker for all of its spin-offs, and will jump at any opportunity to revisit the world of Persona 4. And in March, I'm going to have the chance to do just that, as Atlus are re-releasing the second Persona 4 fighting game, Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. If you like Persona 4, but haven't played Arena Ultimax, definitely don't skip this re-release. Not only is Ultimax a great fighting game that lets you duke it out as characters from Persona 3 and 4, but its story mode, which is a visual novel with fights interspersed throughout, serves as a canon sequel to Persona 4. If I'm entirely honest, I don't even know how to feel about Stranger of Paradise. I like the premise of Team Ninja making a Final Fantasy spin-off, as they've proven with Neo and the Ninja Gaiden games that they can make superb action games, and I think making this a prequel to the original Final Fantasy to celebrate the series' 35th anniversary is awesome. But once we actually started seeing trailers for this game, my hype levels took a nosedive. Stranger of Paradise's visuals look undeniably dated, and it's hard not to cringe at the clumsy dialogue as the rap rock listening protagonist rants about killing chaos. But once Square Enix released a playable demo of Stranger of Paradise, the response was mostly positive, with players praising the game's satisfying combat mechanics. I actually didn't jump into the demo, because being a Final Fantasy fanboy, I knew whether it was good or bad, I was going to end up playing this game anyway, so I'd rather just go in unspoiled. This is one of those rare games where I just can't get any real gauge of how it'll pan out. I could see this scoring in the 8s, and I could just as easily see it getting 5 out of 10s. Kirby is another important series having an anniversary this year, as 2022 marks 30 years since the titular Pink Puff made his debut. So of course we have to get a new Kirby game to celebrate, and this new game, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, has me more excited than I've ever been for a Kirby game. Nearly every Kirby game released in recent years has been a side-scroller, but the Forgotten Land is ditching that formula, instead being a 3D platformer like the Kirby games of the N64 and GameCube days. It also looks really strange. The Forgotten Land sees Kirby exploring locations like shopping malls in some kind of long-forgotten dystopian world. As usual, the gameplay focuses on Kirby's ability to suck up enemies and mirror their abilities, which allows him to gain access to new areas of the game's maps. From the second I saw this game, I was just so intrigued by its strange premise and I can't wait to fully explore its bizarre post-apocalyptic world. Borderlands is perfect video game comfort food, and I've probably put 100 hours into every Borderlands game because of it. Borderlands' loop of completing quests to get better loot so that you can complete more quests for even better loot is endlessly addictive and makes it literally perfect as a podcast game. And I have no doubt that I'll lose dozens and dozens of hours to this new fantasy spin-off, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, which is taking Borderlands 2's incredible D&D themed expansion, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon's Keep, and turning it into its own full-blown game. A first-person shooter set in a fantasy world filled with magical creatures is a completely novel concept that I can't help but grin like an idiot at. I just hope Wonderland's writing is stronger than Borderlands 3, because I'd say 90% of the jokes in that game missed for me. In March, we'll finally be getting the long-delayed next-gen ports of Grand Theft Auto 5. I'm sure at this point I don't need to tell you that GTA 5 is an excellent game. You've more than likely played it yourself. I mean, who hasn't at this point? I haven't played through the story of GTA 5 since the PS4 port came out, and the closer we're getting to this remaster, the more excited I'm getting to revisit it. I loved the characters and writing of Grand Theft Auto 5, but it's almost 10 years old, and anytime I've tried to jump into GTA Online, I've immediately noticed that the game is starting to show its age. So I'm very interested to see what gameplay improvements Rockstar have made with this port, seeing as they've been very vague about what the promised enhanced gameplay entails exactly. In fact, despite this being labelled as an enhanced and expanded version of the game, all we really know about it is that it'll feature improved visuals and seamless switching between the campaign's 3 protagonists. So I hope that we'll find out what else has been added and changed in the coming weeks. The LEGO games never fail to provide a good time. They're fun to play, offer an abundance of things to do, and are always packed to the brim with fan service for the franchise that the game is adapting. And LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga is shaping up to be the biggest LEGO game yet, and a substantial leap forward for TT Games. Not only is the Skywalker Saga far better looking than any of the prior LEGO games, but it seems like an evolution for the series' gameplay as well, featuring more diverse mechanics and a new closer camera angle. LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga also features over 45 levels, 5 for each of the 9 mainline Star Wars movies, and over 300 playable characters. I couldn't even tell you how many LEGO games I've platinumed, and I'm really looking forward to just shutting my mind off, smashing away at bricks, and collecting everything there is to find in the Skywalker Saga while listening to music and podcasts. Despite having a ravenous fan base, the Advance Wars series has lain dormant since Advance Wars Days of Ruin released on the DS in 2008. And since then, countless Nintendo fans, myself included, have been begging for Nintendo to revive the series. And in 2021, our wishes finally came true with the announcement of Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp. These are 2 of the best strategy games ever made, and they've been lovingly recreated for the Switch with a new art style and re-recorded soundtracks. I cannot wait to replay both of these games, as for years it's been frustratingly difficult to play them legally. I'm also stoked that an entirely new audience are going to experience Advance Wars for the first time and hopefully fall in love with the series. I'd like nothing more than for this remaster to reignite interest in the series so that Nintendo can justify remastering the DS games or developing a brand new Advance Wars title. Over the past few years, IllFonic have seemingly started a trend of turning 80s franchises into asymmetrical multiplayer games with games like Friday the 13th and Predator Hunting Grounds. Now, Boss Team Games is taking a crack at this formula with Evil Dead the game. The first thing that struck me about Evil Dead is that it looks a lot more polished than Friday the 13th or Predator. Evil Dead the game sees a team of humans facing off against hordes of deadites controlled by both other players and the AI, and it seems to be pretty faithful to its beloved source material, keeping the absurd tone and over-the-top violence intact. The Forest is a game that sees the survivor of a plane crash having to find a way to survive in a forest filled with cannibalistic creatures. Despite the game's hardcore nature, it managed to find a pretty sizable audience, and went on to sell over 5 million copies. And in May, its sequel, Sons of the Forest, will be dropping. Interestingly, Endnight seem to be playing their cards very close to their chest with this game, and despite Sons of the Forest's release being less than 4 months away, we still know very little about the game, as the team have only released a few vague trailers. While this isn't my kind of game, I know how much people loved The Forest. If you want to see just how hardcore its audience are, just take a look at how meticulously they've dissected all of the trailers for Sons of the Forest in search of clues about the game's story and mechanics. I was blown away by Forspoken when it was revealed as Project Athia during the PS5 reveal event. Its spell-flinging combat and fluid traversal look unlike anything I've seen before. It's also ridiculously good looking, with flawless animation, impressive character models, and striking particle effects. But as we've seen more of this game, I've begun to grow concerned with the tone of Forspoken. It almost feels like it doesn't know exactly what it wants to be. It's building this grand fantasy world, but its dialogue is filled with jokes that aren't landing for me. What makes this strange to me is that it's got an unbelievably good lineup of writing talent working on it, including Uncharted creator Amy Hennig and Rogue One writer Gary Whitta. I'm really hoping that this is a situation similar to Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, where the trailers just aren't doing the writing justice, and the comedy will play better in context. Saints Row has been lying dormant for a while, since the release of 2014's Gat Out of Hell. But in 2022, the series is making its long-awaited return in the form of a full reboot. I've always liked the Saints Row games, and their commitment to being as over-the-top and ridiculous as possible. I know some fans of the series aren't happy with the new direction, feeling like it's too much of a departure from what we've come to know Saints Row as, with this reboot seemingly toning things down a bit, and being far less in your face and crass than the original Saints Row games. But I've actually been really impressed by what we've seen for Saints Row so far. While it's lacking the edgy comedy of past games, its gameplay seems as chaotic and absurd as ever. And frankly, with this kind of open world game, gameplay is what matters most to me. Scorn is a long-in-development horror game that's garnered a decent amount of hype from horror fanatics for its disturbing H.R. Giger-esque creature design. Scorn features a blend of survival horror and first-person shooter gameplay, and sees you playing as a nightmarish, skinless creature traversing an oppressive alien world filled with techno-organic monstrosities. Scorn is one of 2022's most unique-looking games, but certainly not a game for the faint of heart. Bethesda Game Studios are one of the biggest and most important RPG studios in the world, and they have a lot to prove with their latest game, Starfield. Not only is Starfield Bethesda Game Studios' first release since the lackluster Fallout 76, but it's also their first release since being acquired by Microsoft, so they really need to bring their A-game with this one, which I feel confident that they will. While we've seen Bethesda tackle fantasy and dystopias through their Elder Scrolls and Fallout games, Starfield marks the studio's first time crafting a sci-fi universe, which is very exciting. Starfield has been in development for a very long time, so I'm expecting something revolutionary out of this game. It's also worth noting that it's launching on the 11th of November 2022, exactly 11 years to the day after Skyrim was released. Another dormant series making its return in 2022 is Stalker. Stalker was a fan favourite series among hardcore PC gamers in the mid to late 2000s, but after seeing 3 games released between 2007 and 2009, the series disappeared, and this sequel has had a very interesting road to launch. Stalker 2 was originally announced in 2010, only to be cancelled in 2012 after the studio making it dissolved. But just when it seemed like the Stalker series was dead for good, the team reformed and the project was resurrected, with Stalker 2 being officially re-announced in 2018. Stalker 2 will mark the first time that the series has appeared on consoles as well as PC, which for someone like me who leans way more towards consoles than PC, is very good news. Like its predecessors, Stalker 2 is a first-person shooter set in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where you'll have to fight off scavengers and mutated creatures. It's also a very impressive looking game that'll seemingly be a great showpiece for what the Series X is capable of. Stalker 2 also just underwent a massive delay from April to December, so it's clear that GCS Game World wants Stalker 2 to be in the best shape possible before it sees the light of day. Which is definitely good news, as I'd rather not see any more cyberpunk situations anytime soon. A Plague Tale: Innocence felt like a game that came out of nowhere. It didn't seem to have that much buzz behind it pre-release, but once it dropped, it proved to be a critical darling, praised for its fascinating world and emotional storytelling, leading to it cropping up in countless Game of the Year discussions, so it's only natural that it'd receive a sequel. A Plague Tale Requiem is set to continue the story of siblings Amicia and Hugo after the events of the first game, though our protagonists are a little older now, and their increasing maturity seems to be reflected in the gameplay. While A Plague Tale was focused on stealth and required you to mostly just avoid enemies altogether, Requiem lets you take a more proactive approach, as it features an increased focus on combat. Ark was one of the first huge hits for the survival game genre, so it was only a matter of time before we saw a sequel, but I certainly wasn't expecting this to be what the sequel looks like. Ark 2 seemingly has a story mode that prominently features Vin Diesel for some reason, and its reveal was just about the weirdest thing I've seen in a long time. I don't usually play survival games, but I'll definitely at least try this game because its bizarre nature has me curious to say the least. We had long heard rumblings that Ubisoft had an Avatar game in development, but at E3 last year, we finally saw it unveiled officially as Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, a first-person open-world game from the team behind The Division that'll see us exploring a never-before-seen area of Pandora. It'll also be the first major Ubisoft game to skip last-gen consoles and release only on current-gen consoles, so it'll be exciting to see what they can do with an open world game built from the ground up for the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles. While little else is known about this game, it's probably a safe bet that Ubisoft are hoping to get it out towards the end of 2022 to coincide with the release of the new Avatar movie. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are some of the highest rated CRPGs of all time, and in the 20 plus years since they've released, they've remained many people's favourite role-playing games due to their strategic combat and world building in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. So needless to say, fans have been waiting a long time for this game, and fortunately for them, Baldur's Gate 3 is in good hands, as it's being developed by Larian Studios, the team behind the acclaimed Divinity Original Sin series. I can already tell that this isn't a game for me, but I know how much this series means to people, and I'm sure Baldur's Gate 3 will be nothing short of excellent. I love character action games. In fact, I'd say it's one of the first game genres that I truly fell in love with, and I would argue that Bayonetta 2 may very well be the best character action game ever made, so Platinum have a lot to live up to with this sequel. Bayonetta 3 was announced way back in 2017, and I've been eagerly anticipating it ever since, desperately waiting for any scrap of gameplay or information. Needless to say, I was over the moon when we finally saw gameplay in 2021. I think this game looks spectacular. Bayonetta 3 maintains the fast, fluid, and stylish combat that's made Bayonetta so iconic, while implementing new mechanics like letting you directly control the giant creatures made out of Bayonetta's hair that were previously only utilised in QuickTime events. It cannot be overstated how important of a game Braid is. When this puzzle platformer launched in 2008, it played a huge part in sparking the indie game revolution of the Xbox Live Arcade days. Braid's challenging and thoughtful puzzles and surprisingly deep narrative made it the highest reviewed Xbox Live Arcade game ever and recontextualized the way gamers viewed downloadable games. If you didn't play Braid back in the day, this re-release is a must-play, as to this day, Braid remains a one-of-a-kind experience. The Callisto Protocol is a spiritual successor to the Dead Space series, being directed by Dead Space co-creator Glenn Schofield. Strangely, it's also set in the PUBG universe. The Callisto Protocol takes place in the distant future in a prison colony on Callisto, one of the moons of Jupiter. I loved Dead Space, so it wasn't hard to sell me on this game, but seeing as we've only got a CGI trailer so far, I could easily see the Callisto Protocol being pushed to 2023. The Devil in Me is the fourth game in the Dark Pictures anthology, following last year's House of Ashes. Each of the Dark Pictures games has tackled a different subgenre of horror, and with The Devil in Me, it feels like Supermassive are dipping their toes into the Saw style of horror. The Devil in Me follows a documentary crew who are invited to a recreation of the house of Henry Howard Holmes, America's first serial killer. But once they arrive at the house, they quickly realise they've stumbled into a trap planted by a depraved murderer who makes art out of his victims. It seems like each of the Dark Pictures games has been better than the last, as Supermassive have taken on board the criticism levelled at their prior releases, though I can't help but feel like none of their successive releases have ever quite recaptured the magic of Until Dawn. Perhaps The Devil Inside will be the game to finally do it, or maybe Until Dawn was just lightning in a bottle that'll never fully be surpassed. We already talked about the Callisto Protocol a moment ago, Dead Space's spiritual successor, but now we have to talk about the real deal itself, with the Dead Space remake. Dead Space is one of the best survival horror games ever made, and it stands the test of time to this day. So EA need to be very careful about remaking this game, but so far, they're saying all the right things. We know that this remake will retain the core story of the original game, see Gunnar Wright returning to voice Isaac Clarke, and of course offer a full visual overhaul of the game. But we don't know exactly how Motive are going about modernising the gameplay of Dead Space, as this is yet another game that we've only seen a CGI trailer for, and because of that, I would be shocked if Dead Space Remake actually launched this year. But I love Dead Space and would like nothing more than for EA to prove me wrong. Digimon has a long history of video game adaptations, but there's never been one quite like Digimon Survive. Most of the recent Digimon games have been pretty standard turn-based JRPGs, but Digimon Survive is a visual novel that's broken up by turn-based strategy battles and survival elements. Survive also features a branching narrative that can drastically change the course of the game, shifting everything from your Digimon's digi-evolutions to which characters live and die, which makes Survive sound a lot darker than I'd usually expect a Digimon game to be. Digimon Survive sounds like a bit of an odd blend of gameplay concepts, so we'll have to wait and see if all these ideas gel together to form a cohesive product, or if we just end up with a jumbled mess. I love Dragon Ball. I fell in love with the series as a kid, and I've consumed practically every piece of Dragon Ball content that's been put out since. It's easily been one of the most influential and formative series for me, helping define my interests as an adult. But even I never could have seen this game coming. Dragon Ball The Breakers is an asymmetrical multiplayer game set in the Dragon Ball Xenoverse universe, and it sees one player controlling one of Dragon Ball Z's iconic villains, while the other team plays a group of survivors trying to hide from the villain and get to a time machine to escape. The person playing as the villain gets the choice of playing as Frieza, Cell, or Kid Buu, while the survivors play as Bulma, Oolong, or a random male or female human. As the villains hunt the survivors, they become more and more powerful, meaning the longer you take to escape, the slimmer your chances of success become. The Earth Defense Force games are nearly always an absolute blast. In EDF, you play as different classes of soldiers who have to fight wave after wave of gigantic bugs. EDF basically has a similar appeal to a Musou game, allowing you to kick back and zone out as you blast your way through thousands of enemies with its expansive arsenal of overpowered weapons. Earth Defense Force 6 is another game that was planned for 2021, but was pushed back to 2022, so hopefully it does actually release this year, because we've still seen strangely little of EDF 6. Freedom Planet is a Sonic-inspired platformer that launched in 2014 after a successful Kickstarter campaign, and now 8 years later, Galaxy Trail are following it up with a sequel. I never played Freedom Planet at launch, and actually only checked it out after it was ported to the Switch, but I thought it was great, so I'll definitely be in on the sequel at the ground floor. Freedom Planet 2 is far bigger in scope than the original, featuring 4 playable characters and 24 stages, as opposed to the first game's 3 playable characters and 14 stages, and it'll seemingly add some more depth to combat through the introduction of unique guard abilities for each of the playable characters. Ghostwire Tokyo is a pretty big departure from Tango Gameworks' prior work on the Evil Within series. While those games were Shinji Mikami making spiritual successors to his Resident Evil games, Ghostwire just looks like the studio throwing all their craziest ideas together to create an entirely new style of game that blends Japanese horror with first-person action. I don't think it's hyperbolic to call Ghostwire Tokyo one of the most uniquely original games I've ever seen. Ghostwire takes place in a version of Tokyo taken over by mysterious spirits after nearly all of Tokyo's citizens have mysteriously vanished. You battle these spirits by flinging spells at them that are cast with Naruto-esque hand signs, until you've dealt enough damage to expose and destroy the spirit's core, vanquishing the spirit once and for all. Ghostwire Tokyo looks weird as fuck, and I'm all about it. God of War 2018 is one of the best video games I've ever played, so my hype for Ragnarok is through the roof. In fact, it's my most anticipated game of 2022. God of War 2018 is a 10 out of 10. Its story, graphics, exploration, and combat are all stellar, and the Leviathan Axe is the most satisfying feeling weapon I've ever used in a game. So the idea of getting a game that's even more refined than God of War 2018 is beyond exciting. Ragnarok takes place 3 years after God of War 2018, and will see God of War's Norse saga come to an end. Just thinking about the huge events teased by God of War 2018's epic ending, and what we could see in a game named after Norse mythology's end of days, gives me chills. I can't even imagine the pressure Santa Monica must have felt while making a sequel to one of the best games of all time, knowing the fan expectations that come with it. But I know that if any studio can live up to the hype, it's Santa Monica. I'm a huge DC fanboy. In fact, the DC universe is my favourite fictional universe ever, and the Bat family are one of my favourite parts of that world. Gotham Knights takes place following the death of Batman, and sees the Bat family teaming up to take down the mysterious Court of Owls, who have secretly been pulling the strings behind Gotham City for centuries, as well as other members of Batman's rogues gallery, like Mr. Freeze. In Gotham Knights, you can play as Nightwing, Robin, Batgirl, or Red Hood, each of whom will play differently and have their own unique abilities. I love Batgirl, Nightwing, Red Hood, and Robin, and I can't wait to play as all of them in Gotham Knights, though I'll definitely be maining Nightwing, as he's a top 5 all-time comic book character for me. And as a random unrelated side note, I've got to recommend the current Nightwing run. Tom Taylor has been absolutely crushing it, and everyone should check it out. It's also worth keeping in mind that Gotham Knights takes place in its own universe, entirely separate from the Arkham universe, despite being developed by WB Games Montreal, who developed the criminally underrated Batman Arkham Origins. Hopefully with Gotham Knights, they'll finally get the recognition that they deserve. Granblue Fantasy Relink has had an interesting road to release. This action RPG is a spin-off of mobile RPG Granblue Fantasy, a game that's massively popular in Japan. Relink was originally pitched as a collaboration between Cygames, the creators of Granblue Fantasy, and action games royalty Platinum Games. But at some point, Platinum dropped out of the project, and it's now being developed entirely in-house at Cygames. While the Granblue franchise is huge in Japan, it wasn't until the fighting game spin-off Granblue Fantasy Versus came out last year that the series made its debut in the West. I was checking out some gameplay for Relink while making this video, and was a little caught off guard by just how good it looks. Its beautiful world and stylish combat gave me major Tales vibes, which I'm all about. I was also pleased to see that the soundtrack is being composed by legendary Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu. Hogwarts Legacy is a dream game for many a nerd. Taking place in the late 1800s, it sees you playing as a student of Hogwarts. You'll create and customise your own witch or wizard, be sorted into a house, and set out on your adventure, as you attend classes, explore an open world featuring iconic locations like Hogsmeade Village and the Forbidden Forest, duel evil wizards, and interact with a myriad of magical creatures. It also features a morality system that'll determine what path your character goes down. The Harry Potter universe is so rich and ripe for storytelling, and the fact that for years all we've been getting is aggressively mediocre Fantastic Beasts movies is a crime. So I'm excited to see something entirely new in this world, and see Avalanche explore a time period of this universe that we know very little about. I fantasized about playing a Harry Potter game like this as a kid, and the fact that in 2022 it's actually going to become a reality is honestly a little surreal. After a 5-year wait, we'll hopefully be getting the Breath of the Wild sequel this year. Despite still not having a name, we have gotten 2 trailers so far for this game, and they've both been extremely cryptic. Though ironically, I think that's only bolstered hype for the game, as it's led to rampant fan theories about the story, mechanics, and even if there's more than one playable character, as nearly every shot of gameplay has only shown the back of the player character. And that just goes to show how palpable the excitement around Breath of the Wild's sequel is. While the majority of trailers for Breath of the Wild felt whimsical and exciting, the trailers for its sequel feel strangely dark and ominous, which just makes me even more intrigued. Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece, and one of the few games I still find myself revisiting from time to time years later. The sense of wonder that Breath of the Wild's world fills you with is unparalleled, so imagining the potential for a sequel with tweaks to the gameplay and more traditional Zelda dungeons has me hyped beyond belief. Mario + Rabbids Kingdom Battle was one of the first big surprises on the Switch for me. I went into Kingdom Battle knowing that I love Mario, but pretty much despise the Rabbids, so I really didn't have many expectations for Kingdom Battle. So the fact that it turned out to be a great and surprisingly challenging XCOM-style strategy game, and one of the best games of the Switch's first year on the market, was surprising to say the least. Unlike Kingdom Battle, its sequel Sparks of Hope will see us leaving the confines of the Mushroom Kingdom and going on a galaxy-hopping adventure. Sparks of Hope also sees the battle system being revamped, ditching the grid-based layout of Kingdom Battle for the ability to freely move around a certain distance in a set radius. This'll offer more freedom and bring traversal more in line with games like Valkyria Chronicles. We'll also get a couple of new playable characters in Sparks of Hope, in the forms of Rosalina and her Rabbid counterpart. After all, Mario can't go on a galaxy-inspired adventure without Rosalina. Sticking along the same lines of Sparks of Hope, we have another XCOM-style game, Marvel's Midnight Suns, though this one's actually being developed by the XCOM team themselves. It feels like just about every superhero game we get is a third-person action game of some kind, with rare exceptions like the Injustice games. So it's great to see Marvel games branch out and license their IP to something so different. In Midnight Suns, you'll get to create your own superhero called the Hunter, then customize them with over 40 unique powers. You will then go out on missions with different Marvel heroes, including all of the big guns like Captain America, Iron Man, Wolverine, and Doctor Strange, as well as other characters that are a little less iconic, but just as interesting, like Nico Minoru, Magik, and the Robbie Reyes version of Ghost Rider. As you play through Midnight Suns, you'll also be able to forge bonds with the different heroes and make choices that affect the story's outcome. It looks like we're going to have a huge run of strategy and tactics games in 2022, because next up is Metal Slug Tactics, and I cannot overstate how dope this game looks. Metal Slug Tactics was revealed at Summer Game Fest Kickoff Live last year, and it was easily one of the highlights of the show. Ditching the run-and-gun action of the mainline Metal Slug games, Tactics drops the Metal Slug cast into grid-based battles that remind me a lot of one of my favourite indie games of recent years, Into the Breach. Tactics is also gorgeous. It's so impressive how perfectly Laika Studio have managed to translate the iconic pixel art of the Metal Slug series into an entirely different genre of game. MultiVersus is a Smash Bros clone, which isn't all that uncommon these days. Just last year we got Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl after all, but there are a couple of things that separate MultiVersus from your average platform fighter. MultiVersus is coming from Warner Brothers and is pulling its roster of fighters from several of their biggest properties, including DC Comics, Looney Tunes, Game of Thrones, and Adventure Time. And the characters announced so far only scratch the surface of properties that could be featured in MultiVersus, with Warner Brothers having the rights to many of the world's biggest franchises, including Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, and Rick and Morty. The well of potential fighters for this game is near limitless. MultiVersus also seemingly has all of the right ingredients to foster a healthy online community. It's free to play and offers rollback netcode and cross-platform multiplayer. If the gameplay lives up to its potential, and Warner Brothers don't try and nickel and dime players too much with microtransactions, they may very well have a hit on their hands with MultiVersus. Outlast is genuinely one of the most stressful games I've ever played, and it almost single-handedly influenced a whole generation of horror games. Unfortunately, this also meant that we got an endless array of Outlast clones to diminishing returns, and at this point, this style of horror is feeling pretty played out. With the latest Outlast game, The Outlast Trials, Red Barrels are attempting to prevent the series from growing stagnant through the introduction of a massive new gameplay element, multiplayer. It'll also serve as a prequel to the other Outlast games, taking place during the Cold War, with its protagonists being victims of a twisted experiment. I'll be interested to see if the Outlast Trials can maintain the tension of the first two games, as horror is inherently less scary when you're with other people. Oxenfree's mysterious story, painterly art style, and immersive sound design made it one of the most memorable indie games of the last generation, and now 6 years after its release, we're finally getting a sequel. Taking place 5 years after the first game, Oxenfree 2 Lost Signals stars a new protagonist named Riley, an environmental researcher who returns to her hometown to investigate unusual and seemingly paranormal radio transmissions. I'm glad that Oxenfree 2's trailer is so vague. Slowly unravelling the mystery surrounding these radio signals was one of the best parts of the first game, so the less I know going into Oxenfree 2, the better. The Prince of Persia series is hugely nostalgic for me. I really like the entire PS2 trilogy, but Prince of Persia Sands of Time is a particularly special game to me. In fact, it's one of my favourite games ever, so when its remake was announced with a less than impressive trailer, I was beyond disappointed. It looked so rough visually and completely lacked the charm of the original game. I wasn't alone in this feeling, with the trailer being met by a near universally negative response. Fortunately, not long after its reveal, Ubisoft delayed the Prince of Persia remake indefinitely from its initial release date of January 2021. Ubisoft are clearly aware of how important of a franchise Prince of Persia is, and aren't hesitating to give the Sands of Time remake the extra time in the oven that it so clearly needed. And with it being over a year since we last saw Sands of Time, I'm expecting it to be in drastically better shape when we finally see it again. Arcane are arguably one of the most consistent developers in the world, with the Dishonored games, Prey and Deathloop all being major critical hits, and in 2022 we'll be getting their latest game Redfall, which is also their first Xbox exclusive following Microsoft's acquisition of Bethesda last year. Redfall is a co-op shooter set in a world overrun by bloodthirsty vampires. Thankfully, Redfall's 4 playable characters are well equipped to take out these evil bloodsuckers, as they're armed to the teeth with an array of weapons and gadgets, as well as telekinetic powers. I was instantly drawn to Redfall because of the creativity showcased in its arsenal, with its protagonists using guns that fire sunlight and stakes, and even an umbrella that shoots a charge of energy to send vampires flying. River City Girls is one of the best beat-em-ups of recent years. It's a spin-off of the River City Ransom / Kunio-kun series that took the concept of its predecessors and flipped it on its head by starring the girlfriends of River City Ransom's heroes as they fight their way through town to rescue their boyfriends who have now been kidnapped. This sequel retains the crisp pixel art and snappy combat of the first game, but also sees the addition of 2 new playable characters, additional weapons and enemy types, and larger levels with branching paths. Ubisoft get a lot of shit for making lots of games with similar concepts and mechanics, but that's definitely not a criticism anyone can level at Roller Champions. This 3v3 roller derby game has a real opportunity to carve out its own niche, as there's simply nothing else like it on the market. To score points in Roller Champions, you'll need to get hold of the ball and keep possession of it for a full lap of the rink, which isn't as easy as it sounds, as the opposing team will be chasing after you and attempting to knock you down. While its premise sounds niche, I could definitely see this being a game that surprises people and finds its audience, similar to how Knockout City blew up last year. While I've never watched RWBY myself, I know how huge and passionate its fanbase is, so I'm sure they're eagerly awaiting the latest gaming addition to the franchise, RWBY Arrowfell. Unlike the prior RWBY game, Grim Eclipse, which was a third-person co-op action game that was made in-house by Rooster Teeth Games, RWBY Arrowfell sees the series being licensed to another studio, WayForward, who are adapting the series as a 2D side-scroller with Metroidvania elements, though it's retaining the co-op aspect, with all 4 members of Team RWBY being playable and solo players being able to switch between them on the fly. WayForward are a great studio who have proved their side-scroller development chops time and time again with the Shantae series, so if you're a RWBY fan, there's good reason to be optimistic about Arrowfell. Sea of Stars is a JRPG from Sabotage Studio, who made The Messenger, one of the best platformers of recent years. JRPGs are one of my favourite genres, and this looks like a remarkable one. Sea of Stars pixel art is immaculate, and it looks like it's making some meaningful changes to the JRPG formula to streamline the experience. Firstly, Sea of Stars combat functions similarly to the battle systems found in the Mario RPGs, as you'll be able to deal extra damage or reduce incoming damage by tapping a button in time with the game's animations, making the battle system a little more active than your average JRPG. Secondly, Sea of Stars features no grinding or random battles, which will make it more accessible to non-JRPG fans. And finally, Sabotage Studio are also using their platforming expertise to give Sea of Stars far more traversal options than other role-playing games. Shadow Warrior is a series all about excess. It's obnoxiously violent, grotesquely gory, extremely crass, and a whole lot of fun. And the blood-drenched chaos is set to continue in the third entry of Flying Wild Hog's Shadow Warrior reboot series later this year. These frenetic first-person shooters see you eviscerating enemies with an absurd arsenal of weapons and seamlessly switching between sword and gun-based combat. The big new change with Shadow Warrior 3 is that it's massively expanding the series' traversal mechanics with the addition of wall running, a double jump, and a grappling hook, which will make movement much more fluid. Somerville follows a family and their pet dog trying to survive an alien invasion, and it has massive Limbo/Inside vibes, and there's a reason for that. Somerville is the debut game from Jumpship, a studio co-founded by Dino Patti, who also co-founded Playdead and served as executive producer for both Inside and Limbo. Somerville looks ominous, stressful, and absolutely incredible. I don't know if there's any other series as inconsistent as the 3D Sonic games. While we've gotten some real bangers like Sonic Generations, Colors, and the adventure games, we've gotten even more bad 3D Sonic games with the likes of Sonic 06, Sonic Boom, and Sonic Forces. Needless to say, the series needs some rejuvenation, and the Blue Blur's latest game, Sonic Frontiers, could provide just that. It's clear that Sonic Frontiers' open world, filled with sprawling fields and beautiful vistas, is drawing more than a little inspiration from Breath of the Wild. Unfortunately, we still don't know much about the mechanics of Sonic Frontiers, which were of course the most important part. I want to know how Sonic Team are planning to make exploration and Sonic's speed feel interesting in this massive open world. Sonic's speed is the crux of the franchise, but it's also often the series' biggest problem, as the games have a tendency to encourage you to go fast, then punish you for doing so by throwing random spikes and pitfalls in your way without leaving you enough time to react to them. Ironically, this game could have the opposite problem. If Sonic's in these vast open areas that don't seem to have many real threats, what's going to make running from point A to point B interesting? Splatoon is one of Nintendo's newest franchises, but it's quickly become one of their most popular. I think sometimes people underestimate just how big Splatoon is. Splatoon 2 is one of the Switch's best-selling games. In fact, it's in the console's top 10 selling games, shipping over 12 million copies, so Splatoon 3 is going to be huge. Splatoon is arguably the most original shooter of the past couple of generations, with its multiplayer matches being based around gaining control of the map by having your team cover more of the map in paint than your opponents. 2 saw the series put a bit more of a focus on its single-player campaign, and it seems like Splatoon 3 will continue this trend, with its campaign, Rise of the Mammalians, set to explore more of Splatoon's weirdly charming dystopia. Now we come to the one and only mobile game on this list, Star Wars Hunters. Though, to be honest, it is probably only on here because it's also coming to the Switch. When this was announced, I had almost zero interest in it. A free-to-play, mobile-focused arena shooter holds very little appeal to me. But once Zynga showcased some gameplay, it actually piqued my interest a little. Maybe it's just because I had such low expectations, but Star Wars Hunters actually looks a lot better than I expected. The lineup of playable characters, consisting of bounty hunters, Wookiees, stormtroopers, and Force users, actually look pretty cool, and the gameplay seems fun. It might very well turn out to be rubbish, but as a fan of Star Wars, I'm down to give Hunters an honest shot. On the note of Star Wars, let's also keep our fingers crossed that 2022 will be the year that we see a full reveal for the sequel to Jedi Fallen Order. Stray was one of the most eye-catching games shown at the PS5 reveal event. set in a dystopian future where humans cease to exist, having been replaced by robots. Stray sees you controlling a regular house cat and its droid companion as it attempts to find its family. To me, the most striking aspect of Stray is its animation. Watching its feline protagonist climb and pounce around, it almost feels uncanny how perfectly Blue 12 Studio have managed to recreate the way a cat moves. As I said when talking about Gotham Knights, I freaking love DC, so obviously I'm also pumped for Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I've loved the Suicide Squad for years, and I'm glad to see the property finally getting the love it deserves. Following the 2016 movie, which the less said about the better, I was worried that the IP could have been tarnished, but with James Gunn's incredible movie last year, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League this year, and a couple of really great comic runs in recent years, it seems like the Suicide Squad are in a better place than they've ever been. Unlike Gotham Knights, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League does take place in the Arkham universe, and sees the Suicide Squad assigned their most deadly mission yet, assassinating the Justice League, whose minds have been corrupted and controlled by Brainiac. I love everything about what Rocksteady have shown of this game. The pitch for the game's story sounds awesome, its gameplay looks great, and its traversal actually gives me pangs of my favourite Xbox One game, Sunset Overdrive. And Rocksteady seem to have nailed the characterization for the whole squad. I'm really looking forward to seeing Rocksteady's take on the Suicide Squad as well as the Justice League, as their Arkham games focused largely on Batman and his allies and rogues gallery. Suicide Squad can be played with between 1 and 4 players, and it looks like its 4 squad members will all play drastically differently, with Harley being melee focused and very acrobatic, Captain Boomerang combining his signature boomerang attacks with a device that's granted him super speed, Deadshot of course being a sharpshooter who excels at ranged combat but can also take to the skies with his jetpack to pick off enemies from above, and King Shark obviously being a giant tank who shreds everything in his path. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is nipping at the heels of God of War and the Breath of the Wild sequel as one of my most anticipated games of the year. And seeing as it's been almost 7 years since Rocksteady released Batman Arkham Knight, Suicide Squad can't come soon enough. System Shock is an extremely influential game, and the forefather of the Bioshock and Deus Ex series. System Shock is a first-person action game that takes place in a cyberpunk world aboard a space station and follows a hacker trying to stop a malevolent AI. I'm a huge Bioshock fan, but I've never actually played System Shock, so I'm excited to finally experience the game that inspired one of my all-time favourites when System Shock Remake drops later this year. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge is a fantastic looking beat-em-up that's set to capitalise on gamers' nostalgia for the classic SNES and arcade Ninja Turtles beat-em-ups. The pixel art in Shredder's Revenge is out of this world, and the gameplay looks like a total blast. And there's a good reason why Shredder's Revenge looks this good. It's being developed by an all-star team who have experience working on the sublime Scott Pilgrim game. In Shredder's Revenge, you and up to 3 other friends can play as the 4 Turtles or April O'Neil as they fight their way through waves of Foot Clan soldiers and take down the Turtles' iconic lineup of villains, including Bebop, Rocksteady, Krang, and of course Shredder himself. While we know Shredder's Revenge has 5 playable characters so far, I'd be surprised if we don't get at least one more character announced before launch, and my money would be on the hockey gear wielding Casey Jones. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is such a uniquely special IP. I mean, who doesn't feel nostalgia for the Turtles? It's one of the few properties that's managed to remain popular across several generations of viewers, with each generation having their own specific touchstone for the series. Shredder's Revenge is tying itself to the world of the 1980s cartoon, which makes sense, seeing as even decades later, it's still arguably the most iconic iteration of these characters, even if my nostalgia is largely rooted in the 2003 cartoon. Trek to Yomi was revealed at E3, and it immediately skyrocketed up the list of my most anticipated games. Trek to Yomi is a side-scrolling ode to classic samurai movies, and it's unbelievable how authentic its gorgeous black and white visuals feel to the movies that inspired it. It basically looks like a playable Akira Kurosawa film. I'm also still struggling to process the fact that this is being developed by the same studio as Shadow Warrior 3. It seems like Flying Wild Hog are a much more flexible studio than they're given credit for. And with that, we've gone through 75 of the biggest games scheduled to release in 2022. This was by far the longest video I've ever made, and needless to say, it was a colossal editing process. So thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming videos, where I'll be reviewing Nobody Saves the World and Rainbow Six Extraction. Before I sign off, I'd also like to say another quick thank you to everyone who watched my Far Cry 6 review, as I took a look at my analytics today and saw that it's now my most watched video ever.